Daniel had grown used to the rhythm of his quiet, hard-working life. A single father to 7-year-old Ethan, he carried the weight of both provider and protector on his weary shoulders, balancing long hours as a janitor with tender moments of bedtime stories that masked his exhaustion. Saturdays were his sacred gift, the one day when he could take Ethan to the park, breathe in fresh air, and forget about bills and responsibilities for a while, even if just for an hour. That afternoon, the sun painted the sky in hues of gold as children filled the playground, their laughter ringing like music across the field. Daniel settled onto a weathered bench, his eyes following Ethan, who ran toward the swings with boundless energy. For a fleeting moment, peace touched his heart, until his gaze caught sight of a little girl standing alone near the slide, her soft giggles quickly turning into fearful silence as a group of older boys closed in around her. They sneered, tugging at her small backpack, mocking her in cruel tones that cut through the air. The little girl's wide eyes shimmered with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag, and something deep inside Daniel snapped. Without hesitation, he rose from the bench, his voice booming across the playground, "Hey! Leave her alone!" The bullies froze, startled by the sudden authority in his tone, and within seconds, they scattered, vanishing like shadows retreating from the light. The girl stood frozen, hugging her backpack to her chest, a tear slipping down her cheek. Daniel knelt in front of her, softening his voice, his eyes filled with the same protective warmth he gave Ethan. "You're safe now," he assured her gently. "Are you okay? Where's your mom or dad?" The girl sniffled, whispering that her mother had stepped away to take a phone call, leaving her alone for just a moment. Ethan, sensing her unease, ran over and offered her a swing, his small gesture pulling a shy smile from her trembling lips. Within minutes, the playground rang once again with laughter as Ethan and the girl played, their innocence erasing the sting of the bully's cruelty. Daniel stayed close, keeping watch, the instinct to guard her as strong as if she were his own. He didn't know her name, nor did he expect anything in return, but as he stood beneath the shade of the park's tall trees, he felt a strange sense of purpose in that moment. What he didn't realize, however, was that this single act of stepping forward, of protecting a child who wasn't his own, would ripple far beyond the quiet park. The girl's laughter, restored by kindness, was only the beginning of a story that would soon test the limits of his heart and reveal a truth that would change his life forever. Just as Ethan pushed the girl higher on the swing, her small bursts of laughter echoing across the playground, a woman's frantic voice sliced through the air, calling out a name, "Lila." The girl's head snapped up, her eyes brightening with recognition as she leapt off the swing and ran toward the elegant figure hurrying across the grass. Daniel watched as the woman scooped her daughter into her arms, clutching her tightly as though afraid to let go, her phone still clutched in her other hand, her face pale with panic. She pulled back only long enough to scan her daughter for injuries, then her sharp gaze landed on Daniel, who stood a few feet away with Ethan by his side. "Did you protect her?" she asked, her voice trembling, her tone carrying both gratitude and urgency. Daniel nodded simply, explaining how a group of boys had tried to bully Lila until he intervened. For a moment, relief softened the woman's polished features, gratitude flickering in her eyes. She introduced herself as Amelia Carter, her voice steady but warm, and the name tugged at something in Daniel's memory, though he couldn't quite place it. "He scared them away, Mommy," Lila whispered, still holding on to her backpack as though it were a lifeline. "He kept me safe." Amelia bent slightly, meeting Daniel's eyes with sincerity that felt rare coming from a stranger. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than the simple words themselves. Daniel, uncomfortable with praise, shrugged and replied, "I just did what any parent would do." The children, unaffected by the heaviness of adult exchanges, had already started playing again, Ethan chasing Lila across the grass as their laughter rang clear and sweet. Daniel stole glances at Amelia as they sat on nearby benches, speaking in short bursts between watching the children. She carried herself with a kind of natural authority, her poise and elegance starkly different from his world of modest living and hard labor. There was something magnetic about her, but also something distant, as though she belonged to a life far removed from his own. After a while, Amelia checked her watch, her expression tightening as if pulled back into the demands of a busier world. She called for Lila, who hugged Ethan goodbye before skipping to her mother's side. Amelia offered Daniel one last nod, her voice warm yet formal as she said, "I'm glad you were here today. Truly." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, her daughter in hand, leaving Daniel standing beside Ethan with a strange hollowness in his chest. As they walked home together, Ethan chattered excitedly about his new friend, while Daniel's mind lingered on Amelia's face, her presence, and the curious familiarity of her name. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself it was just another passing encounter, nothing more. After all, he had a night shift ahead, and real life didn't leave much space for daydreams. What he couldn't know, as he tucked Ethan into bed and prepared for another long night at work, was that Amelia Carter was far from gone, and their paths were destined to collide again in a way he never could have imagined. The following morning, Daniel trudged into Carter Enterprises, his mop bucket squeaking across the polished marble floors as the early sun filtered through the towering glass windows, casting sharp reflections that made the building look even more intimidating. He had worked there for nearly 3 years, always unseen, the kind of man people brushed past without a second glance, and though the job was tiring, it was steady, and steady was what he needed for Ethan's sake. He tied his worn apron and began his shift as usual, cleaning the lobby while employees with pressed suits and shiny shoes streamed past him, some nodding politely, others pretending he didn't exist. But today, there was a different energy in the air, a buzz of anticipation that grew louder with each passing minute. "She's here," someone whispered near the elevators, "the CEO is visiting this morning." Daniel didn't think much of it until the sharp click of heels echoed across the marble, a sound that seemed to command silence. When he lifted his head, his heart nearly stopped. Striding through the entrance with assistants trailing behind her was Amelia Carter, the same woman from the park, the same mother whose little girl he had protected just the day before. Daniel's mop handle slipped slightly in his grip, his chest tightening as realization slammed into him. She wasn't just another parent at the playground, she was the CEO of the very company where he scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. Amelia moved with confidence, her tailored suit exuding authority, her eyes scanning the building with the ease of someone who owned every inch of it. For a fleeting moment, her gaze landed on Daniel, and recognition flickered in her eyes. Time seemed to pause as they looked at each other, the invisible line between their worlds suddenly drawn bold and undeniable. Daniel expected her to turn away, to look through him the way everyone else did, but instead she gave the faintest nod, subtle, but acknowledging. Still, the moment left him shaken, and as she disappeared into the elevator surrounded by her staff, Daniel felt the weight of his place in the world press harder on his shoulders. He was just a janitor, a man scraping by to raise his son, while she was the head of a company that seemed like an untouchable empire. The memory of her gratitude at the park clashed painfully with the reality of seeing her here, powerful and untouchable, while he stood invisible in the background. As he wrung out his mop and forced himself back to work, Daniel's thoughts churned. To Amelia, he was probably nothing more than an employee, a name on a payroll list, someone who belonged in the shadows of her company's shiny walls. But then he remembered Lila's words, the way she had clung to him and whispered, "He kept me safe." That thought alone eased the sting of humiliation and reminded him that while titles and status separated people in the world of business, moments of courage and kindness were worth far more. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of something far greater, something he wasn't ready for but couldn't escape. The days that followed felt strangely heavy for Daniel, as though the brief recognition in Amelia Carter's eyes lingered in the halls long after she disappeared into her corner office, and though he tried to stay invisible, sweeping corridors and polishing windows without drawing notice, fate had other plans. One late afternoon, when the building was quieting down and most employees had already left, Daniel remained behind, carefully scrubbing the marble floor of the lobby, his thoughts drifting to Ethan at home waiting for him with school drawings and bedtime chatter. Suddenly, the familiar sound of a child's laughter rippled across the grand space, pulling his head up in surprise. There, skipping across the floor in her school uniform, was Lila, her backpack bouncing as she ran, her voice echoing joyfully through the high ceilings. And beside her, walking with the calm grace of someone who was always in control, was Amelia. The moment Lila saw Daniel, her face lit up, and without hesitation she rushed toward him, throwing her small arms around his leg in a hug so innocent it silenced the entire lobby staff who had stopped to watch. "Mommy, look! It's him! The man who saved me," she exclaimed, her voice ringing with pride. The eyes of the employees shifted curiously to Daniel, their janitor, the man they'd overlooked for years, now standing as the center of a story none of them had expected. Amelia approached slowly, her expression softer than the sharp professionalism she wore like armor, and when she reached Daniel, she looked not at his uniform, nor at the mop in his hand, but directly into his eyes. "You may work here as a janitor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "but to me, you'll always be the man who protected my daughter. And that is worth more than any title in this building." Her words, spoken in front of her staff, carried a weight that silenced the room, dismantling the invisible walls of status that had separated Daniel from everyone else. For the first time, his worth wasn't measured by the shine of the floor beneath their feet, but by the courage he had shown when no one else was watching. Daniel, overwhelmed, could only nod, his throat tightening with emotions he couldn't put into words. Later that evening, as he walked home beneath the fading glow of the streetlights with Ethan's small hand tucked into his, he thought about Amelia's words, about Lila's smile, and about how easily he could have stayed seated on that bench, done nothing, and remained unnoticed forever. Instead, he had chosen to stand up, to protect, to care, and that simple choice had reminded him of something far greater than the struggles of bills and shifts. It reminded him that true worth is not bought by money, earned through titles, or displayed in power, but lived through the moments when a man chooses to do what is right, no matter how small. And in that truth, Daniel finally felt richer than he had ever been.